Before the blade ever fell, Marie Antoinette had already been executed, not by steel, but by humiliation. In the last 76 days of her life, the Queen of France was stripped, watched, and broken down piece by piece, until she was no longer a woman or a mother or even human, but an exhibit of revolutionary virtue. Her hair was cut, her body bound, her son turned into a weapon against her. Every moment of her suffering was written down like a report, proof that pain could be justice. The guillotine was only the ending. The real death came long before. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. August 2nd, 1793. Paris slept beneath a sky thick with smoke and exhaustion when soldiers entered the Temple prison. They tore Marie Antoinette from her children's arms and dragged her into the waiting darkness. By dawn, she reached the Conciergerie, the city's final gate between the living and the condemned. Inside, stone walls sweated and the air smelled of rust and mildew. They assigned her a number, 280. The title, Queen of France, was erased, her past sealed away like contraband. Her world shrank to a cell no larger than a pantry, a straw bed, a dripping ceiling, and 2 guards who never looked away. Day and night, they watched. She ate under their gaze, changed under their gaze, prayed under their gaze. Even her breath belonged to the Republic. Surveillance was no longer about safety. It was about annihilation. The slow grinding of identity beneath the weight of virtue. In this place, silence had rules. She was forbidden to cry when they mocked her, forbidden to speak of her husband, forbidden even to mention her children. Every gesture was noted, every weakness filed in reports delivered to the Revolutionary Tribunal. The state wanted not just her confession, but her disintegration. A performance of guilt played out inside 4 damp walls. At night, when footsteps faded and the city's fever quieted, she would sit beside a flickering candle and stare at her trembling hands. Once, those hands had signed royal decrees, held her children, brushed silk and perfume across Versailles. Now, they shook from cold and hunger. The woman who had embodied luxury was being rewritten into an object lesson, the revolution's perfect villain. Outside, the mob demanded vengeance. Inside, the system delivered it, efficiently and politely. No blood yet, no violence, only bureaucracy. Her humiliation became paperwork, her humanity, an entry in the prison ledger. But behind the rituals of punishment lingered something deeper, an unspoken need to prove that the monarchy's power could be undone by spectacle. They could not simply kill her, they had to make her watch herself being destroyed. In those first weeks at the Conciergerie, death was not the enemy. The real torment was endurance. The long, quiet unraveling of a woman the world had already decided to hate. And as Paris celebrated its revolution, she sat in the dark, learning what it meant to die before dying. The Conciergerie was not a prison. It was a rehearsal. Every stone, every dripping pipe, every rule carved into the day was designed to prepare her for one thing: disappearance. When Marie Antoinette arrived, she still carried traces of the world she had once ruled. A few locks of powdered hair, the ghost of perfume on her dress, a faint instinct to smile when addressed. But within hours, that world was stripped from her. Her silk gown was exchanged for coarse grey cloth. The guards took her jewels, her ribbons, her lace, anything that could remind her she had once been adorned. Even her hairpins were confiscated, as if beauty itself were an act of treason. The transformation was deliberate. The revolution did not simply want to punish a monarch. It wanted to erase the idea of monarchy from flesh and bone. Her degradation was the nation's cleansing. Her new home was a small cell at the end of a narrow corridor. The walls sweated lime. The straw mattress stank of damp. A single candle, too thin to last through the night, flickered in the draught. And beside her bed, the two guards, always present, always staring. They were not cruel men. They did not need to be. The cruelty lay in the command they obeyed, that she must never be left unobserved. She slept beneath their eyes. She undressed behind a thin wooden screen while they stood a few feet away. They listened to her prayers. When she woke trembling in the night, they pretended not to notice. The humiliation was methodical, a machinery of small degradations grinding down the will. Every hour was measured not by bells or clocks, but by the sound of boots in the corridor, the rhythm of the state breathing just outside her cell. Beyond those walls, Paris roared with life, markets, debates, executions. But here, time was syrup. The hours folded into one another until even memory began to blur. To the revolution, her suffering was a form of education, the public unlearning of divine privilege. If kings had ruled by spectacle, then justice too must be theatrical. Pain became a stage, and she the unwilling actress. But in the solitude of that cell, something unexpected began to form. The woman they tried to erase, the queen, the symbol, slowly collapsed into something simpler, quieter, more human. She no longer dreamed of Versailles. She dreamed of her children. The silence was worst at dawn. She would hear the guards exchange whispers about who would be taken next. Somewhere down the corridor, another prisoner would cry out, then vanish forever. The sound of the bolt sliding shut afterward was like a punctuation mark at the end of a human life. For 76 days, she existed between two worlds, the living and the condemned. The conciergerie was known as the antechamber of death, and she became its most silent inhabitant. Each morning began the same. The guards would enter, note her condition in their logbooks, and hand her a cup of thin broth. Sometimes they brought news, cruelly distorted gossip about her trial, her husband's execution, or her son's re-education by the Republic. They told her the boy had been forced to curse her name, that he now called her the Widow Capet. At first, she refused to believe it. But when a warden casually repeated the story, describing the boy's trembling signature on a false confession, something inside her cracked, not visibly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of glass under pressure. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in the candlelight, motionless, lips moving soundlessly. When dawn came, her eyes were red, but her posture, straight, regal, remained. The woman who had once ruled courts now ruled only her own composure. The guards began to speak of her differently, no longer with contempt, but with unease. There was something in her restraint that unsettled them. They expected hysteria, pleas, despair. Instead, She moved with the calm of someone who had already crossed a border no one else could see. One young soldier, barely 20, once muttered as he left her cell, "She still looks like a queen." His partner hissed at him to stay quiet, but the words lingered in the stale air like incense. The revolution feared symbols, yet, in trying to destroy one, it created another. Each day, more visitors came, clerks, inspectors, officials, under pretexts of procedure. They stared at her like a specimen, noting her pallor, her posture, her silence. Every look was a reminder. She existed now for observation, not remembrance. And still, she endured. There were small rebellions, subtle, almost invisible acts of defiance. When they mocked her husband's execution, she did not flinch. When they questioned her faith, she crossed herself in full view. When they called her the widow, she answered to her title, Madame. She knew there was no escape. The law would not save her. Mercy was a relic from another age. But she understood something her captors did not. Dignity, once stripped bare, cannot be confiscated, only tested. In those weeks of waiting, she became both victim and witness, a mirror reflecting what revolution looks like when its thirst for purity devours compassion. Outside, crowds screamed for justice. Inside, justice had already become ritual, a daily rehearsal of humiliation performed in the name of equality. She once told her attendant, Rosalie, in a rare whisper, "They think they are killing a queen. They are only teaching a woman to die." By then, she no longer wept. Her tears had dried into a kind of silence, sharper than any cry. Every empire invents its own form of execution. For the monarchy, it was the blade. For the republic, it was time. The slow erosion of a life beneath constant eyes. The guillotine would end her body. But the weeks before it, the waiting, the watching, the breaking, those were meant to end her soul. Yet, the record shows she did not yield. In that narrow cell where dignity was forbidden, she rebuilt it from the ruins. And that is why, when the guards finally came to open her door, they did not see a ghost. They saw something far more dangerous. A woman who no longer feared the machine waiting outside. No weapon cut deeper into Marie Antoinette than the loss of her son. The night they came for him, the revolution crossed a line even it could not name. It was July, still thick with the summer air that clung to the stone walls of the temple prison. The boy, Louis Charles, 8 years old, small, gentle, with his father's eyes, had just fallen asleep when boots thundered through the corridor. The guards burst in, torches flaring, and she threw herself over him by instinct. "He's only a child," she cried, but words were useless against a mob convinced that mercy was corruption. They pried him from her arms. His cries echoed through the stairwell long after his footsteps vanished. She would never see him again. In the darkness that followed, Marie sat on the floor clutching the torn edge of his blanket. The air reeked of sweat and smoke. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply stared at the wall until dawn, as if memorizing the silence that had replaced her son's breathing. For the next months, she lived with a wound that refused to close. The reports written by her guards record a strange calm. The prisoner remains quiet, her eyes often wet, but her demeanor unbroken. They did not understand that her grief was not weakness. It was a form of endurance. But the Republic did not stop at separation. It needed proof that she was more than a tyrant, that she was a monster. And so, it turned the boy into a tool of propaganda. Louis Charles was placed in a dank cell beneath the temple tower, left under the care of a cobbler named Simon, a man chosen not for his compassion but for his loyalty to the new order. Simon's task was not to educate the child, but to retrain him, to unmake a prince and rebuild him as a revolutionary parable. They called it Republican education. It meant forcing a child to repeat oaths of hatred against his own blood. It meant teaching him to curse the names of his parents until those names lost all meaning. When officials came to verify the success of the experiment, they wrote in their notes that the boy had admitted to every sin whispered against his mother, even the one too obscene to repeat. That accusation, that she had violated her own son, would later echo through the courtroom of the tribunal. It was not justice. It was theatre, performed on the body of a child. When the news reached Marie Antoinette's cell, the guards expected rage. Instead, she went still, as if the air had thickened around her. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "He must have been made to say it." It was not disbelief. It was understanding. The recognition of a system that had replaced faith with vengeance. From that day, she no longer spoke of her son aloud. But at night, Rosalie, her attendant, saw her lips moving silently, repeating the same two names, Louis and Thérèse, over and over until exhaustion often pulled her into sleep. The revolution's records never mention that detail. They only note unusual muttering. Outside the prison, pamphlets spread like wildfire, describing her as the Austrian harlot, the corrupter of France, the she-wolf of Versailles. But behind the damp walls of the conciergerie, she was something the mob could never imagine. A mother grieving in silence for a boy who was being taught to hate her. That was the true cruelty of the revolution's justice. It made virtue indistinguishable from barbarity. The Republic had promised equality. Instead, it had created a mirror image of monarchy, one that ruled through fear rather than faith. Every insult hurled at her, every rumor crafted by the press was part of the same machinery. A system that consumed people to keep itself alive. Marie's cell became a kind of laboratory. Through her humiliation, the revolution tested how far it could go before conscience broke. When she survived that, when she refused to cry before her accusers, they realized that the spectacle required escalation. Her motherhood had not been destroyed, it had been weaponized. The boy who once carried her legacy now carried the revolution's message, that blood could be rewritten and purity reassigned. But beneath that machinery of hate, Marie found a strange strength. She had nothing left to protect, no illusions left to lose. Her silence became her rebellion, a refusal to give her captors the reaction they wanted. Rosalie later wrote that, in those final weeks, the Queen's face seemed to change. The fear drained away. Her gaze, though hollow, was steady, calm enough to unnerve the men who mocked her. She frightened them, Rosalie confessed. Not with power, but with patience. That patience, the slow defiance of a mother stripped of everything, was what the revolution feared most. Because a system built on rage cannot survive the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to hate back. By September, the machinery was ready. Rumors of her trial began to circulate through the corridors. The guards grew restless. Officials whispered that the tribunal was assembling witnesses. She did not ask who. She already knew. When one soldier sneered, "Your own son will speak against you," she looked up from her straw mattress and said softly, "Then he is the truest victim among us." In that moment, the mask of the revolution cracked, if only for a heartbeat. The guards looked away. The woman the world had painted as a monster had become something else entirely, a mirror reflecting their own cruelty. Outside, drums thundered in the streets of Paris, announcing another execution. Inside, in cell number 280, Marie Antoinette sat in the half-light, her fingers tracing the edge of a torn handkerchief embroidered with her children's initials. It was the only relic left of a life the revolution had erased. When dawn broke the next morning, she folded it carefully, placed it beside her heart, and whispered to the silence, "If this is justice, let it be finished." The trial was coming, but before the verdict, the world would witness a moment that no law, no tribunal, no blade could ever explain. The transformation of a condemned queen into something the revolution could never kill, conscience itself. The courtroom was not a place of judgment. It was a theatre, and the play had already been written. On the morning of October 14th, 1793, after 76 days in the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette was led through the corridors of the prison into the Hall of Liberty, a name that mocked its own meaning. The guards marched ahead of her, their boots echoing against the stone like muffled drums. Outside, Paris swarmed. Crowds filled every street, not to see justice, but to witness the fall of a myth. When she entered the chamber, silence rolled through the air. She no longer looked like a queen. Her once golden hair had faded to white, cropped short and uneven. Her skin, drained of blood and sun, seemed almost translucent under the torchlight. But something in her posture, the tilt of her chin, the steadiness of her eyes, unsettled even her enemies. For a moment, the spectacle wavered. The actors forgot their lines. Then the prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, stepped forward. His words were sharp and rehearsed, a performance meant to rouse applause. He listed her crimes one by one, not as evidence, but as verses of propaganda. Treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, draining the nation's wealth, corrupting the morals of France. Each accusation was designed not to prove guilt, but to feed hunger. The public's need to see its pain reflected in a single human form. As the words poured out, the crowd erupted in waves of cheers and jeers. But through it all, she sat silent, hands folded, expression unmoved. It was not defiance. It was exhaustion so complete it looked like serenity. The trial was a ritual, not an inquiry. Witnesses were summoned like actors entering a stage. Some were former servants eager to prove loyalty to the new regime. Others were opportunists, rehearsing stories drawn from the revolutionary pamphlets that painted her as a harlot and traitor. None had seen her for months, but their hatred remained vivid, as if she lived rent-free inside the nation's grief. They accused her of hosting debauched feasts while peasants starved, of plotting her husband's escape, of laughing at the suffering of the poor. The audience roared at every claim. The truth no longer mattered, only emotion did. And that was the revolution's most dangerous invention, the replacement of law with feeling, of evidence with theatre. Fouquier Tinville leaned forward, his voice rising. "You have devoured the wealth of France. You have drenched the nation in tears. You have poisoned your own bloodline." The chamber exploded in noise, and then silence. The prosecutor paused, savoring the moment, then raised a sheet of paper and declared, "There remains one final crime, one that makes even nature tremble." He let the words hang before pronouncing them. Incest. The air changed. Even the guards looked away. He claimed that her own son, the Dauphin, had confessed that his mother had defiled him. The child's forced signature lay on the paper, the proof the revolution needed to strip her of the last dignity she possessed: motherhood. For several seconds, Marie did not move. The torches crackled. The crowd held its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried through the entire hall. "If I have not answered, it is because nature itself refuses to reply to such an accusation. I appeal to all mothers who are here." It was only one sentence, but it shattered the performance. In the women's gallery, whispers spread. Mothers, market sellers, widows, the same ones who had once marched to Versailles demanding bread, felt their throats tighten. Even among those who despised her, something shifted. For a fleeting moment, the revolution remembered its own humanity. Tinville's face burned with fury. He slammed his fist on the table and barked for silence. The proceedings resumed, but something irreversible had happened. The Queen, the people had learned to hate, had turned into a mirror, forcing them to see what their righteousness had become. The rest of the trial passed like a storm. Witnesses were called, testimonies recited, sentences rehearsed. Her lawyer, assigned only days before, was not permitted to defend her freely. Every question was a trap, every answer a condemnation. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, it was not to discuss her fate, but to confirm it. Outside, the city thundered with expectation. Crowds gathered near the Palais de Justice, chanting, laughing, drinking. The revolution had become a festival of death. Inside, she waited. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze remained fixed on nothing. For 2 days, the trial continued, though its outcome had been carved in stone long before it began. On October 16th, at 4 a.m, she was summoned back to the chamber. The judge's words were formal, almost indifferent. "Marie Antoinette, widow of Louis Capet, you have been found guilty of high treason. The sentence, death by guillotine." There was a pause, as if someone expected her to plead, to curse, to cry. She did none of those things. She looked at the men who condemned her, some smug, some uneasy, and said quietly, "What more could I add?" The record states that her tone was calm, almost gentle, but witnesses said that her eyes, pale, exhausted, luminous, carried something no tribunal could destroy: the dignity of a woman who had been stripped of everything, yet refused to kneel. The revolution had its verdict. The crowd would have its spectacle. But the question lingered in the room like smoke. If this was justice, Why did it feel so much like revenge? As she was escorted back to her cell, the sound of the courtroom dissolved into distant thunder. Outside, Paris roared with triumph. Inside, a single candle flickered beside the number 280 scratched into the wall. Tomorrow, she would meet the blade. But tonight the revolution would learn that it had not broken her spirit. Because the moment she appealed to all mothers, the symbol they built to hate had turned back into a human being. And no verdict, no guillotine could reverse that. The crowd outside had begun celebrating, long before the verdict was spoken. The revolution had found its villain, and villains made the Republic righteous. But within the courtroom, as the words "incest with her son" echoed through the hall, the illusion cracked. For the first time, the noise of hatred faltered. Even among those who despised her, a kind of paralysis spread. The accusation was too monstrous, too deliberate. A final act meant not to condemn her body, but to annihilate her soul. Her son's coerced confession had been prepared days earlier, extracted in the damp cell beneath the temple. The boy was small, barely 9, kept in filth, fed on scraps and bullied by guards until fear rewrote his memory. When the officials asked their questions, he repeated what they wanted to hear, his voice breaking with confusion. They made him sign a paper he couldn't read. Then they sealed it with the Republic's stamp, a lie given the weight of law. By the time that paper reached the tribunal, it was no longer a child's statement. It was evidence of corruption, paraded like a sacred relic. The revolution could now claim that the monarchy's rot had spread to the bloodline itself. It was a perfect script, except for one problem. They had underestimated her silence. When the prosecutor pronounced the words, she did not shout, did not faint, did not collapse. She simply looked at him, and then at the women in the gallery. Her lips trembled, but her voice did not. If I have not replied, it is because nature herself refuses to answer such a charge. I appeal to all mothers who are here. There was no ornament, no rhetoric, only raw truth. And that truth traveled faster than the shouts of propaganda. It crossed the hall like a current, striking every woman who had ever held a child. Even some revolutionaries lowered their eyes. For one instant, the tribunal ceased to be a stage, and the crowd remembered that the body they had condemned was still human. Rosalie, her young attendant, later recalled that moment in a whisper. Her words were not loud, yet they silenced the entire room. They stripped the judges of their anger. She spoke not as a queen, but as a mother, whose grief no blade could touch. It lasted only seconds before the machinery of justice resumed its rhythm. Tinville's voice rose again, ordering the proceedings onward, desperate to reassert control. But something irreparable had happened. In that small act of defiance, that calm refusal to plead, she had done what no army could. She had made the revolution hesitate. It was a dangerous gift. Empathy was contagious. And in the world of terror, compassion was treason. The trial continued deep into the night. Witnesses came and went like shadows, offering stories lifted from rumor and pamphlet. Each statement was another nail hammered into the coffin of truth. A seamstress swore. She had seen Marie sending secret signals to Austria through embroidered dresses. A servant claimed she smuggled gold out of Versailles in her hair. Each tale was absurd, yet Each one earned applause. The court was not weighing guilt. It was feeding hunger. From the benches, citizens jeered. "Down with the Austrian witch! Let her pay for our hunger!" Every insult was a purge, a way for the crowd to forget its own complicity in years of suffering. Through it all, she sat motionless. Her silence became unbearable to them. Not submission, but accusation. In their attempt to break her, they had turned her stillness into judgment. When the jury finally delivered its decision, the sentence was already familiar: death by guillotine. But beneath the formal declaration, there was unease. Even the executioners felt it. In her final hours in court, a strange inversion occurred. The woman meant to embody guilt began to absorb the role of witness. She had seen what power looked like when it abandoned justice. Outside the courtroom, the news spread like fire. The widow Capet is to die. The streets erupted in celebration. Men drank, women sang, drums rolled through the squares. It was not triumph. It was exorcism. The revolution needed to prove to itself that its violence was purity. But inside the conciergerie, when she returned to her cell, the silence fell again. Rosalie followed her, trembling. The queen sat on her straw bed and stared at the wall, her hands resting on her lap. "They accused me of crimes that belong to those who invent them," she whispered. Rosalie wept. Marie touched her arm. "Do not cry for me. Cry for the child who was forced to say it." The guards, listening from behind the door, said nothing. One later admitted that at that moment he wanted to kneel. When dawn came, the officials entered with papers to sign. She signed calmly, her handwriting steady, her face unreadable. In that signature, she performed her final act of defiance, participating in her own condemnation without surrendering an inch of herself. There are many forms of execution. Some use blades, others use words. The revolution chose both, but by turning her son into a weapon and her trial into spectacle, it revealed something unintended, that its new morality required a continuous enemy to survive. And now that enemy was a woman who refused to hate. She was led back to her cell, her steps slow but even. Outside, the city roared. Inside, the candlelight quivered on the wet stone. Rosalie followed her in silence, clutching the hem of her dress. That night, as the guards locked the door behind them, one of them murmured under his breath, half in awe, half in fear, "She no longer belongs to us." He was right. The Republic had condemned her body, but in doing so, it had freed her from its reach. The revolution thought it had written the final act. But what it had really done was give her story a power that no decree, no tribunal, and no execution could contain. Tomorrow she would walk toward the scaffold, but tonight the world's most hated woman sat in the dark, unbroken, and waited, not for death, but for the truth that would follow it. When she spoke those 7 words, "I appeal to all mothers who are here," Marie Antoinette did not just defend herself. She fractured the revolution's illusion of purity. In a hall built for judgment, she had done the unthinkable. She made her accusers feel. For months, the revolution had trained its citizens to see her as a monster, an enemy of the people, a parasite who had fed on their misery. But in that one sentence, the monster vanished. What stood before them was something far more dangerous, a human being capable of evoking pity. The women in the audience froze. Many were market sellers, the same ones who had once marched on Versailles demanding bread. They had spat her name in anger, cursed her husband, and prayed for her downfall. But now they saw not a queen, not a symbol, only a mother defending her child's innocence in front of men who had already decided she deserved to die. One witness later wrote, "In that moment, I forgot she was guilty. I only saw a woman wronged." Tinville, the prosecutor, felt the tide turning. His spectacle, the theatre of justice that had fed on hatred, was slipping. His fury returned like a reflex. He banged his fist on the table, shouting for order, calling her whore, Austrian dog, enemy of liberty. He needed the noise to drown out the silence she had created. But the silence persisted. And inside that silence, something unrecorded happened. One of the judges, a minor official whose name has been lost to history, looked away. His pen stopped moving. He could not bear to write the words being spoken. The rest of the tribunal continued its ritual, pretending not to feel the unease seeping through the room. Yet, everyone sensed it. Even the guards, hardened by repetition, glanced at her differently when she passed. She had been condemned long before she walked into that hall. The trial was never about law. It was about cleansing the Republic through the destruction of its chosen scapegoat. But the scapegoat had looked back. When she invoked motherhood, she reminded them of the one truth no ideology could erase, that justice built on cruelty devours itself. The days that followed blurred into exhaustion. The proceedings dragged on not because there was doubt, but because the spectacle required length. Each testimony, each accusation, each insult was a nail hammered into the coffin of conscience. At night, when the courtroom emptied, Marie was led back through the echoing corridors to her cell. The candles flickered. The guards' eyes followed her as if unsure what they were seeing, a defeated prisoner, or someone already beyond them. Inside the cell, Rosalie waited with a small bowl of broth. Marie refused to eat. "I have no appetite for this world," she murmured. Rosalie asked if she feared the guillotine. Marie smiled faintly. "It will be quicker than this." She spoke of her children, not with bitterness, but with tenderness that startled even her attendant. "Tell my daughter never to hate. Tell her that vengeance is a prison worse than this one." Rosalie cried quietly. "They've taken everything from you," she said. Marie shook her head. "Not everything. They cannot take how I choose to die." It was then that her calmness began to unsettle the guards. They had seen convicts scream, pray, curse. None had met death like this, as if walking toward it were merely another duty. The revolution wanted her broken. Instead, it found her composed. Outside, pamphlets painted her as a serpent. But inside, her silence turned into something closer to grace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an awareness that what awaited her was not defeat. Because dignity, once stripped bare, reveals its truest form. When the tribunal returned for the final day, her transformation was complete. The witnesses repeated their lines like actors forced to perform a script they no longer believed. Tinville pressed harder, accusing her of conspiring with Austria, mocking her faith, demanding she confess. She did not. She never would. When they read the verdict aloud, she did not lower her head. She looked directly at them, her gaze steady, almost merciful. She seemed to pity them. The clerk noted, the accused appeared indifferent. But it wasn't indifference, it was clarity. The clarity that comes when one has already endured the worst that power can inflict. That evening, when Rosalie entered her cell, Marie was kneeling before the candle, praying softly. "For whom?" Rosalie asked. "For France," she answered. "They do not know what they are doing. The revolution would remember only the sentence, not the silence that followed it. But to those who saw her that night, something was unmistakable. She had ceased to be their prisoner. The Republic could bind her wrists, but not her meaning." Outside, the bells of Notre Dame rang, echoing over the Seine. The city cheered for vengeance, believing the world had been purified. Yet, in the damp cell of the conciergerie, the woman they hated most had already purified herself, not through punishment, but through endurance. When dawn came, she pressed Rosalie's hand and said, "Do not grieve. It is better to die with a clear heart than to live with a stained one." And as the light crept across the stone wall, something in her face shifted, a serenity so profound that even her captors hesitated to disturb it. The revolution had stripped her of crown, children, husband, and name, but it could not strip her of her final possession, the choice to meet death without hatred. That was the appeal no mother should ever have to make, and it was the one the world would never forget. The verdict came in the dead of night, delivered in the flat, bureaucratic tone that the revolution used to hide its cruelty. It was October 16th, 1793. The clock had not yet struck 5 when the guards entered her cell, papers in hand. Marie Antoinette, widow of Louis Capet, one of them read, "You have been found guilty of high treason. The sentence is death by guillotine." The words were spoken with mechanical indifference, like the announcement of a shipment received. But the silence that followed was heavy, not with shock, but with awe. The prisoner on the straw bed did not react. She looked at them as one might look at strangers bringing predictable news. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment the guards thought she might beg. She didn't. "What more could I add?" she said softly. Those were her last recorded words in court. Simple, weightless, yet they hung in the air like judgment itself. The guards shifted uncomfortably. They had expected tears, curses, resistance. Instead, they saw calm, the kind that belongs to someone who has nothing left to lose. As they turned to leave, Rosalie began to cry. Marie placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "It will be soon now. Do not let them see your sorrow. They will mistake it for weakness." And then, as if nothing extraordinary had been declared, she sat at the small wooden table and reached for her quill. There was one thing she needed to do. The letter she wrote that night was not a plea for mercy. It was a testament, her final act of control in a world that had taken everything else. "To my sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth," it began. Her handwriting was elegant but unsteady. She apologized for her pen's tremor. "My hand fails me, but not my heart." She wrote of her children, begging that her daughter be raised with faith, and that her son, poor, broken Louis Charles, be forgiven for the lies he was forced to speak. "He has been misled," she wrote. "He must not be blamed." She asked for no vengeance, only remembrance. She prayed for France, for those who condemned her, for those who would follow her into death. May my blood be the last that is spilled. Every sentence was deliberate, stripped of self-pity. Her words glowed with a strange composure, a dignity purified by pain. When the letter was finished, she folded it with care and pressed it to her lips. Then she handed it to Rosalie. "Keep it safe," she said. But Rosalie never could. The guards seized it before dawn, consigning it to the archives of the Republic. It would not be found for 20 years. As the hours passed, the cells seemed to shrink around her. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, her only clock. Beyond the door, footsteps echoed, sometimes stopping, sometimes pacing, like fate deciding how slowly it would arrive. She asked Rosalie for a clean shift, the plain white linen one reserved for the condemned. When she dressed, her movements were steady, ceremonial. "This will do," she murmured. "It will be easier to cut." Her voice carried no irony, no bitterness, only finality. The guards brought her a little broth, but she refused it. "My body has fed enough on sorrow," she said. For a moment, the younger of the two men hesitated, as if he might speak. Instead, he turned away. Outside, the dawn light began to filter through the narrow slit of a window. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint glow like fragments of gold, a cruel reminder of the splendor she once commanded. She looked at them without expression, then sat again and closed her eyes. Rosalie wrote that she seemed to be praying silently, but not for deliverance. It was as though she were already elsewhere, walking ahead of her own body toward what awaited her. At 6 o'clock, the door creaked open. The clerk from the tribunal entered, flanked by soldiers. "It is time." Marie rose slowly. She adjusted her sleeves, smoothed her skirt, and turned to Rosalie. "Courage, my child. We must die as we have lived, with decency." Then she offered her hands to be bound. The rope was coarse, biting into her wrists. She did not wince. A guard asked if she wished to see a priest. She nodded. Father Girard, a quiet, aging man, entered moments later. The two spoke in low tones. He later testified that she confessed calmly, asked forgiveness for her enemies, and showed no fear. "When I gave her absolution," he said, "she thanked me with tears, not of despair, but of peace." By 7, the streets outside were already swelling. Vendors shouted. Soldiers cleared the path from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution. Crowds gathered early, children sitting on shoulders, women waving flags. It was market day for death, and the price of admission was only curiosity. Inside the prison, Marie Antoinette prepared herself in silence. She brushed back her cropped hair, lifted her chin, and stood near the candlelight. Rosalie later wrote, "She looked as though she were going to a ceremony, not an execution." The Republic had sentenced her to die as a symbol, the final collapse of monarchy. But she had chosen to die as a person, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. The machinery of power had written her ending long before she entered that hall. Every word of her trial, every whisper in the streets had been rehearsed. But in her refusal to perform despair, she stole back something the revolution could not confiscate, the meaning of her own death. The tribunal wanted to erase a queen. What it created instead was a martyr of composure, proof that even in the shadow of the blade, dignity can outlast ideology. When the guards returned to lead her out, She turned once more to Rosalie. "Do not weep," she said gently. "My sufferings are over." And with that, she stepped into the corridor, where her name, her titles, and her crimes no longer mattered. Only the way she walked toward the inevitable, unbent. Night fell over Paris on October 15th, 1793. The city was alive with noise, drunken voices, distant drums, the restless hum of a people celebrating the end of a queen. But inside cell number 280 of the conciergerie, there was only quiet. Marie Antoinette sat by a candle whose flame leaned and trembled in the damp air. The light threw her shadow across the wall, thin, upright, unbroken. The verdict had been read, the sentence sealed. At dawn, she would die. And yet, what filled the room was not fear, but an eerie stillness, as though she had already stepped beyond pain. Rosalie, her faithful attendant, hovered nearby, eyes swollen from crying. She offered bread and broth, but the queen refused. "I need nothing more," Marie said softly. "Everything is finished." Outside her cell, the guards murmured. They had escorted hundreds to death, yet this one felt different. One of them whispered, "She moves like someone walking in her sleep." Another replied, "No, like someone already awake while we are still dreaming." Marie sat at the table, her hands folded before her. For a long time, she did not speak. Then, as if remembering something half forgotten, she asked for paper and ink. They hesitated, but complied. She began to write her final letter. Not to the nation, not to her captors, but to the only person who still mattered. Her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. The words came slowly, like breath leaving her body. She wrote of her children, her daughter Thérèse, imprisoned elsewhere, and her son, lost to the state's cruelty. "Tell him I do not blame him," she wrote. "Tell him I pray for him. He has been misled. They wanted to hurt me through him, but he is still my child." Her tone was calm, forgiving, almost tender. She asked Elizabeth to raise Thérèse in faith, to teach her courage without bitterness. She wrote nothing of revenge, only hope that my blood will be the last that is spilled. Each line was deliberate, stripped of grandeur, polished by suffering. When she finished, she folded the page carefully, pressed it to her lips, and sealed it with a smudge of wax. Then she looked at Rosalie. "Keep this for me," she said. "If they take it, remember the words." The guards took it within the hour. They added it to the archives of the condemned, where it would lie hidden for 20 years before anyone dared to read it. The candle burned low. The cell was silent, except for the steady dripping of water from the ceiling, the slow metronome of her final hours. Rosalie tried to speak, but Marie silenced her with a look. "There is nothing to say," she murmured. "We must die as we have lived, with dignity." For a moment, she seemed almost serene. She gazed at the wall, as though seeing something beyond it. The gardens of Versailles, her children playing in the sunlight, the echo of laughter in rooms now filled with ghosts. She said quietly, "I was happy once. I was also blind. I thought the people's love was as eternal as the crown. I was wrong, but hatred is not eternal either." The words fell like a confession, not of guilt, but of understanding. Rosalie broke down. "Madame, how can you speak so gently after what they've done?" Marie smiled faintly. "Because they do not know what they are doing. If they did, they would pity themselves." Then she reached for Rosalie's hand and squeezed it, whispering, "When they take me, do not cry. I do not want the last face I see to be in tears." As the night deepened, the sounds of the city faded into an eerie calm. She knelt by the cot and prayed, not for deliverance, but for strength. She prayed for her children, for her dead husband, and, most unthinkably, for the people who had condemned her. "May God forgive them," she whispered. "They are sick with fear. They call it virtue." Around midnight, the guards came again, delivering the final orders from the tribunal. She nodded, thanked them with quiet formality, and asked for one last moment alone. When they left, she knelt once more before the candle, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving soundlessly. Rosalie would later recall that the air in the cell seemed to change. It felt as if she was no longer with us, but somewhere beyond reach, already standing in another world. The candle flickered violently, then steadied. Marie looked up. It will not be long now. At 2 a.m, she lay down on the straw bed, her bound hands resting gently on her chest. The candle had almost burned out. Rosalie sat by her side, unable to stop watching her breathe. In the darkness, Marie spoke one final time. "If they ask you what I was like," she said, "tell them I learned how to forgive." Then she closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. The candle sputtered once, twice, then went out. Outside, the Seine rolled quietly under the moonlight. Paris slept. The city that had sworn to destroy her slept soundly, unaware that within the conciergerie, the last queen of France had already found her peace. When dawn crept through the cracks in the wall, Rosalie rose and touched the queen's shoulder. Marie opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "It is morning," she said. She stood, smoothed her dress, and whispered, "Now, my peace begins." The guards would come soon to take her to the scaffold. But for that one suspended moment, between night and day, between history and silence, Marie Antoinette was not a prisoner, nor a queen, nor a villain. She was simply a woman who had endured everything and lost nothing that mattered. At dawn, the prison stirred like a machine awakening. Locks clanged, boots scraped, metal groaned. When the guards came to open cell 280, Marie Antoinette was already standing. She had dressed herself in the plain white gown reserved for the condemned, the color of purity, the color of surrender. But on her, it looked like something else entirely. Defiance made visible. The clerk from the Revolutionary Tribunal entered first, carrying a document sealed in red wax. Behind him came 3 men, the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson and his 2 assistants. Their presence filled the cell with the thick smell of iron and rope. Sanson bowed stiffly. He had killed kings before, but never like this. His voice was flat, respectful out of instinct rather than protocol. "Madame, we are ordered to prepare you." She nodded once, neither proud nor meek, only precise. "I am ready." The ritual began. They told her she must remove her black mourning dress. the one she had worn for her husband's death, and put on the coarse linen of the condemned. She asked quietly, "May I at least change in privacy?" The youngest assistant laughed, embarrassed by his own cruelty. "There are no queens here." They turned away only halfway as she undressed behind a tattered screen. The cold air bit at her bare skin. She moved without haste, folding her garments carefully, as though still in her chambers at Versailles. When she emerged, the white gown clung to her thin frame. Her hair, once powdered gold, had turned almost silver from prison air. The guards averted their eyes, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. There was something unbearable about her composure. Then Sanson stepped forward again. "Your hair, madame. It must be cut." She did not protest. She simply bowed her head. The scissors hissed open and closed, hacking through the pale strands that had once been her crown. The hair fell in uneven heaps onto the stone floor, each snip a punctuation in the slow erasure of a life. When it was done, Sanson gestured to his men. One approached with coarse rope. "Your hands must be bound." Marie looked up, surprised for the first time. "My husband was not bound?" No one answered. The assistant's hands shook as he tied the knot. The fibers dug into her wrists, but she made no sound. Only once did her composure waver, when the rope grazed the small scar on her hand, left by her son's first bite as an infant. It was a tiny wound, years healed, yet it stung now as though he had just bitten her again, a memory sharper than pain. When the guards finished, the clerk read aloud the final confirmation. "Sentence to be carried out this day, in public, at 11 o'clock. Marie listened without expression. The words washed over her like cold rain. Necessary, impersonal, already forgotten. She turned to Rosalie, who stood trembling near the door. "Do not cry, my dear," she said. "You have served me faithfully. Tell my daughter, tell her I went to my death thinking of her." Rosalie collapsed into silent sobs. Marie stepped closer, her bound hands awkwardly reaching to touch the girl's cheek. "Courage," she whispered. "You must live. That is harder than dying." Then she asked for a mirror. The guards hesitated, unsure whether vanity was a crime. She smiled faintly. "I only wish to fix my hair." They brought her a shard of polished metal. She gazed into it, not as a woman admiring herself, but as someone taking final inventory, a face she no longer recognized, a gaze she could still command. When she was done, she handed it back. "It will do." At 7:30, Father Girard returned. He found her standing upright, back to the window, her bound hands clasped. He offered her the crucifix. She kissed it once. "My daughter," he said gently, "do you forgive those who condemned you?" Her answer was immediate. "I do. I pray God will forgive them also. They are blind with fear." The priest began to weep. "You have more faith than I." "Then pray for me as I pray for you," she said, and smiled, a gesture that broke him completely. By 8, the courtyard outside was filled with soldiers. The sound of hooves and wheels echoed through the air as the execution cart was drawn up to the gate. Inside, the final preparations continued. The executioner placed a hood on the table, though she refused it. "I will not hide my face from them," she said. And then, for a brief moment, everything stilled. Even the guards, men hardened by routine, seemed unable to move. There she stood, pale, bound, barefoot on the cold floor, her white gown rippling in the draught. No throne, no jewels, no power. And yet, somehow, more sovereign than she had ever been. When the hour struck 9, they led her down the corridor. The prisoners whispered her name as she passed, pressing their faces to the bars for a glimpse. Some spat curses, others crossed themselves. To all of them, she gave the same look. Not pride, not pity, but a calm acknowledgement, as though she forgave them in advance for what history would remember. As she reached the final gate, Sanson stepped forward. "It is time." She nodded once. "Then let us go." The guards opened the doors. The sound of Paris surged in, drums, shouts, wind. The ritual was complete. The queen was gone. In her place stood only a woman stripped of everything the world had used to define her. And in that nakedness, she had never been freer. The Republic thought it was purifying itself through her destruction. But the act they called justice was, in truth, a mirror. Because by the end of that morning, it was not she who stood accused, but those who believed that cruelty could cleanse a nation. Part 10. The Procession. Through Hate. The doors of the conciergerie opened, and daylight poured in like judgment. The noise of Paris struck her all at once. The drums, the jeers, the murmur of thousands packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for her to pass. The execution cart stood at the gate, a rough wooden wagon caked with dried mud and blood. It was the same cart that had carried thieves, traitors, and peasants before her. There would be no royal carriage, no closed curtains, no dignity of privacy. This was the Republic's new ceremony, public purification through spectacle. Marie Antoinette climbed into the cart unaided, her bound hands awkward but steady. Sanson's men offered help. She refused. "No, thank you," she said quietly. "I can manage on my own." Her white gown fluttered in the cold October wind. Her cropped hair, once the emblem of vanity, now framed her face like a crown of ash. As the cart began to move, a wave of noise followed. Laughter, curses, insults shouted from windows. "Long live the Republic! Down with the Austrian whore! Show us the harlot's face." But she did not bow her head. She stood upright, unflinching, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Artists who witnessed that moment wrote later that she looked more like a statue than a prisoner. Her calm was not pride. It was a form of control, a final refusal to let the mob write her ending for her. The cart rolled slowly through the Rue Saint-Honoré, its wheels creaking like bones. Soldiers walked on either side, clearing the path with bayonets. Above, the balconies were crowded with onlookers, some weeping, some smirking, all watching the fall of monarchy in motion. A young revolutionary, Jacques-Louis David, stood sketching from a window. His pencil moved rapidly, capturing the outline of her face, the tilt of her chin, the hollowness beneath her eyes. That sketch would later become one of the most haunting portraits of the revolution, not of triumph, but of uneasy admiration. Even the painter, who had once glorified the Republic, admitted in his diary. She carried herself with composure that none could imitate. We condemned her, but we could not despise her. The journey to the Place de la Révolution lasted over an hour. The crowd followed like a tide, chanting, laughing, singing patriotic songs. Every few streets, someone hurled bread or mud at the cart. Others spat. When a man shouted, "How much is that head worth now?" she turned slightly, her expression serene. "The price of peace, perhaps," she murmured, though no one heard her. As the procession neared the Tuileries, the palace that had once been her home, a strange silence rippled through the spectators. It was not reverence, but discomfort. They could see her better now, the ropes cutting into her wrists, the trembling of her thin fingers, the faint blue veins under pale skin. It was easier to hate a symbol than to watch a human being. Rosalie, who followed hidden among the crowd, later wrote, "They expected arrogance. What they saw was sorrow, and it confused them." At one point, the cart jolted violently over a cobblestone. She stumbled, nearly falling. The crowd gasped. For a heartbeat, it seemed she would collapse. Instead, she straightened herself and whispered, "Forgive me?" to the executioner who steadied her. That apology, so absurdly polite, so human in the face of hatred, stunned even those who despised her. The closer they came to the square, the louder the noise grew. Bells clanged, drums rolled, vendors sold pamphlets describing her supposed crimes, eager to profit from her final minutes. The smell of sweat, wine, and smoke hung heavy in the air. A woman from the marketplace shouted, "She deserves no mercy. My son starved while she danced in gold." Marie looked toward her, not with anger, but with something resembling sorrow. "If your son lives," she said softly, "then my death is not in vain." The woman froze. The crowd surged again, sweeping the moment away. At last, the cart reached the square. In the center stood the guillotine, its wooden frame towering against the pale sky. The blade glinted in the sunlight, cold, impersonal, efficient. Around it, soldiers formed a perimeter, holding back the roaring crowd. Sanson climbed down first, then extended his hand. She paused, looked at him, and shook her head gently. "No, monsieur, I can descend myself." Her feet touched the ground. Mud splashed up the hem of her gown, but she did not notice. She looked around once, at the people who had come to see her die, at the sky turning silver above them, at the instrument that awaited her. There was no trembling now, only stillness. The soldiers cleared a path through the mob. Some cursed, some crossed themselves. A few, perhaps without knowing why, fell silent. From the distance, someone shouted, "Look at her! She still walks like a queen." It was meant as mockery, but it was truth. Because even stripped of everything, Marie Antoinette carried herself with the same dignity that had once filled palaces. Not arrogance, but composure. As if her death required choreography, and she refused to stumble. Every revolution needs a body to prove its righteousness. That morning, hers was the chosen one. But as she stepped forward, past the soldiers, toward the scaffold, it was no longer clear who was on trial, the woman about to die, or the nation that demanded her death. The drums thundered. The crowd surged forward. She looked up once more at the guillotine, the blade poised like a frozen star. And in that instant, amid the chaos, the hatred, the heat, Paris fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes lifted toward the sky, and she whispered a final prayer no one could hear. The cart was empty now. The procession was over. The revolution had its triumph. But history had found its witness. The crowd rippled like a sea around the scaffold, 1,000 eyes fixed on one small figure climbing the steps. The drums pounded slower now, not to drown her voice, but to frame it. Every revolution needs silence before the strike. Marie Antoinette ascended without help. The ropes at her wrists rubbed raw against her skin, but she didn't flinch. The wooden platform creaked beneath her feet. Above, the blade shimmered, a triangle of polished inevitability. She turned to face the people. The same faces that had once cheered her coronation now leaned forward in anticipation of her fall. But what they saw in her eyes was not terror. It was a strange, almost tender calm. The executioner moved to guide her to the plank. As he stepped forward, she accidentally brushed his foot. For a heartbeat, time stopped, and then she spoke. Her last words. "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." No defiance, no plea, no sermon, only an apology, quiet enough to cut through the roar of the crowd. That single line, so human, so unbearably polite, stunned even her enemies. In that moment, she broke the script. The woman they had turned into a monster ended her life by acknowledging the man sent to kill her. Humility became rebellion. Sanson and his assistants moved quickly, afraid the silence might grow into something dangerous. They untied her hands. The fibers had torn into her flesh. Blood ringed her wrists like bracelets. She laid herself on the plank, her neck resting in the groove, worn smooth by dozens before her. Her hair, cropped short, brushed the wood. One assistant reached to cover her face with the black cloth, but she turned her head slightly. "No, I will not hide from them." The crowd murmured. Even the executioner hesitated. Then, with a single nod, she signaled she was ready. Sanson pulled the lever. The blade fell. A flash of light, a sound like the closing of a door. Then, nothing. The head dropped into the basket. For a breathless instant, no one moved. Then, the square erupted. "Long live the Republic! Liberty forever!" Thousands shouted, fists raised, as the executioner lifted her severed head by its pale hair. He turned in each direction, showing the crowd their victory. Some cheered, others laughed, a few wept. A woman fainted, a child vomited. The revolution had its sacrifice, but witnesses would later whisper that the triumph felt wrong, too loud, too desperate, as if the mob shouted to drown its own doubt. Among those in the front row stood Jacques Louis David, sketchbook still in hand. He wrote later, "Her face, even severed, held serenity. It was not the face of guilt, but of release." The soldiers began dispersing the crowd. Vendors collected coins. The guillotine dripped red into sawdust. It was over. Yet something unseen had shifted. The air itself seemed heavier, as though France had crossed a threshold it could never return from. A journalist present that day described it bluntly. The people shouted for liberty, but when the head fell, many lowered their eyes. The revolution had promised purification through justice. What it had delivered was purification through blood. Her body, headless and anonymous, was placed in a plain cart. No coffin, no shroud, no prayer. The remains were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, where hundreds of others lay in unmarked pits. There, she was thrown into a trench beside the corpses of thieves and traitors, all equal now under the soil. The crowd dissolved into laughter and songs. The drums rolled away down the streets. Paris exhaled, relieved, as if some fever had broken. But beneath that shallow relief, guilt was already germinating. Because for all their hatred, they had seen something unforgettable. A woman stripped of everything, still managing to leave the world on her own terms. She had apologized, not to the nation, not to her accusers, but to the man about to end her life, a gesture that no ideology could explain. It was the smallest act of grace, and therefore the most dangerous, because it suggested that even in the machinery of terror, humanity could still exist. And where humanity exists, tyranny begins to tremble. When night fell, the scaffold stood empty, glistening with rain. The wind picked at the rope ends, the blade hung still. The Republic's great theatre of death had closed for the day, but the echo of its performance lingered in the alleys, in the whispers of those who had watched her die and could not sleep. In the taverns, people told the story differently. Some said she died proud, others said she died innocent. But all agreed on one thing: she had not cried. And somehow that terrified them more than if she had screamed, because silence, in the face of horror, is not weakness. It is the kind of strength that outlives the blade. By the time her blood dried on the scaffold, the crowd had already forgotten her words. But history hadn't. It would carry that quiet apology like a splinter under the skin, a reminder that dignity cannot be executed. The drums stopped. The square emptied. Paris went back to its noise and commerce. And somewhere beneath the ground, in a pit of common earth, the queen who had died with grace began her second life, as the conscience her killers could never bury. They buried her without a name, no coffin, no cross, no prayer, just a cart that tipped her remains into a pit already crowded with bodies, lime, and silence. The Madeleine Cemetery swallowed her the same way it had swallowed hundreds before her, swiftly, efficiently, indifferently. The revolution had no need for graves. It only needed examples. For a while, the world obeyed that silence. Her name vanished from records, her belongings confiscated, her portraits burned. The pamphlets that once screamed her vices now fell out of print. France moved on, convinced that the Queen's memory had been erased, dissolved in the acid of justice. But history does not obey decrees, and some names, no matter how despised, refuse to stay buried. A year later, the same officials who had cheered her death were themselves led up the same wooden steps. The guillotine devoured its own creators. Robespierre, Tinville, the judges who had pronounced her guilty, all met the same ending, under the same blade, before the same crowd. The revolution that claimed to cleanse itself through blood had only learned to breathe through it. And somewhere, in that irony, her silence began to speak louder than their words. In 1815, 22 years after her execution, the cemetery was being cleared for construction. Workers digging through layers of hardened soil, uncovered bones tangled in linen. Among them were two skeletons laid close together, their wrists still bound with rope. One wore the remnants of a white garment, preserved by lime. Beside it, traces of a rosary, and what looked like strands of hair turned to silver dust. The site supervisor hesitated before recording it. Likely the remains of the widow Capet and her consort. Marie Antoinette had finally been found. Her bones were fragile, almost translucent from decay. The revolution had tried to erase her identity. Time had finished the job with gentler hands. But even stripped of everything, flesh, name, rumor, she remained recognizable, not by face, but by story. They carried her remains to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the ancient resting place of kings. For the first time in 22 years, her name was spoken in prayer, not in hatred. Her tomb was carved in marble, her effigy serene, eyes closed, hands folded in eternal composure, the same posture she had kept before the blade fell. And yet, her story was not finished. Because what lingered was not her death, but the question it left behind. Had France killed a tyrant, or had it created one more saint for history's endless religion of martyrdom? Had the revolution destroyed corruption, or simply inherited its theatre? The guillotine was dismantled, its wood repurposed, its blade rusted away. But the idea it embodied, that justice can be proven through destruction, outlived everyone who had built it. Marie Antoinette became something far more enduring than a monarch, a mirror for the age that killed her. Every generation that looked into that mirror saw something different. To some, she was arrogance punished. To others, innocence sacrificed. To most, she was proof that power, once condemned, becomes myth. Jacques-Louis David's sketch of her final ride survived the centuries. Her figure standing in the cart, bound but upright, the faintest suggestion of wind tugging her gown. He had intended to capture the end of monarchy. Instead, he captured the endurance of grace. Even Madame Tussaud, the sculptor of wax horrors, cast her face after death, a gesture that blurred the line between tribute and exploitation. Visitors would later stand before that pale replica, staring into the stillness of features molded from a severed head, unsure whether to recoil or to mourn. The revolution had wanted her forgotten. Instead, it preserved her over and over again in sketches, wax, marble, and myth, every medium except flesh. In the quiet of Saint-Denis, beneath vaulted ceilings and filtered light, her tomb bears a single inscription: Reine de France et de Navarre. No mention of treason, no echo of accusation, just a title, empty to history, but heavy with memory. If you stand before it long enough, you can almost imagine the sound of her voice. I appeal to all mothers who are here. Those words never left. They outlived the drums, the slogans, the blade. They became a whisper carried through centuries, a reminder that even the most despised life can reclaim meaning in the moment it forgives. The revolution had promised freedom through fire, but it was her quiet dignity, not their roaring virtue, that survived the flames. Because power fades when it consumes itself, but grace endures where nothing else can. When they buried her, they thought they had erased her story. In truth, they had immortalized it, not through grandeur, but through the unbearable simplicity of a woman who died with composure. The blade fell. The crowd cheered. The century turned. And still, across the ruins of ideologies and empires, her silence remains, a thin, unwavering line between justice and cruelty, between humanity and the hunger to destroy it. If this story moved you, remember it. Because history's loudest revolutions are often answered, not by thunder, but by one quiet voice whispering in the dark, "Forgive me. I did not do it on purpose."